I have seen some of the worst autopsy photos and crime scene photos you can imagine. None of those hit you in your soul like the pictures you will see in this case, like the testimony you will hear in this case.
Brandi Peters is doing what she does most Friday nights, sitting at the kitchen table, watching her 6-year-old twins hunch over their homework, half paying attention, half already thinking about bath time. She's 27. She works hard, she does hair on the side because she's good at it, and most nights, after the kids are down, she's just tired. The good kind of tired, the kind that means the day went the way it was supposed to. Her youngest is 3. Still at the age where he wants to be wherever she is. It's an evening like 100 others before it. By morning, none of them will still be alive. This case involves the deaths of a mother and her 3 young children. Some details may be difficult to hear. Viewer discretion is advised. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell us what city or country you're watching from today. And if you want more cases like this one, subscribe. Because the answer to what happened to this family wasn't found where investigators first looked. It took a false confession, an international manhunt, and months of dead ends before the truth turned out to be someone standing much closer than anyone wanted to believe. Tallahassee, Florida, November 19th, 2010. The city hums with its usual weekend energy. Students out, restaurants full, porch lights glowing up and down quiet residential blocks. Nothing about this particular evening seems worth remembering. On a street called Saddle Creek Run, one house looks identical to every other on the block. Homework spread across the table. The smell of dinner not long finished. The unremarkable rhythm of a family winding down toward bedtime. Baths, pajamas, a show playing in the background. By the next afternoon, none of that will be true anymore. Whatever happens inside that house tonight unfolds without a sound reaching the street. No sirens, no commotion, just a porch light left on over an empty driveway, while inside, everything is about to change, permanently. The next day, a neighbor tries to reach Brandi. Calls go unanswered. On its own, that means little. People get busy, phones die. But the silence nags enough to prompt a call. Not the non-emergency line, 911. A request for a welfare check, the kind of call officers answer daily, and one that almost always turns out to be nothing. Officers arrive. From the street, everything looks normal. Porch light on, no broken windows, no signs anything is wrong. They knock. They announce themselves. Nothing. They knock again. Still nothing. Experienced officers learn to distinguish between the silence of an empty house and the silence of a house that very much isn't, and shouldn't be. This is the second kind. They go inside. What they find over the next few minutes will stay with them for the rest of their careers. Multiple officers on scene that day will later call it the worst call they ever answered, not for any single detail, but for the sheer scale of what happened inside those 4 walls. The victims, Brandi Peters, 27, her twin daughters, 6 years old, her youngest son, 3. All 4 are gone. An unremarkable Friday night has become one of the most devastating crime scenes in the city's history, and Tallahassee is left asking a question with no answer yet. Who could do this to a mother and her children, and why? As investigators move through the scene, one detail stands apart, and it redirects the entire case. No forced entry. No broken lock, no shattered glass, no pried open window. Every point of access into the house is intact. That fact rules out the version of events that would let the public breathe easier. A random break-in, a stranger who picked the wrong house on the wrong night. It points somewhere far more unsettling instead. Brandi opened that door herself. Whoever did this wasn't a stranger slipping in under cover of darkness. It was someone she trusted well enough to let inside her home late at night with her children down the hall. The investigation's entire shape shifts in that moment. Detectives aren't chasing a phantom in the neighborhood anymore. They're looking at someone in Brandi's life. There's one more piece of evidence giving investigators an early foothold. Traces recovered from beneath her fingernails suggest she fought back. Whatever happened that night, she didn't go without resistance. And in fighting, she may have left behind a genetic trace of her attacker. It's the kind of evidence that closes cases. Investigators just don't know yet where it's going to take them. And the first place it leads is somewhere no one expects. The first real break doesn't come from a suspect on the street. It comes from behind bars. Digging into Brandi's past relationships, detectives learned she'd previously dated James Carlos Santos, a man with a reputation tied to serious criminal activity, currently in federal custody, rumored to have ties to the Los Zetas cartel. A search of Brandi's home turns up something chilling. Letters Santos sent her in the weeks before her death, the language possessive, ominous, referring to her children in strange, proprietary terms. Then Santos reaches out to authorities himself. He wants to talk. And what he tells them seems to explain everything at once. He claims he personally ordered the killings, claims Brandi had crossed the cartel by stealing money and product, and that what happened in that house was retribution carried out on his orders. For a moment, it fits disturbingly well. It would account for the absence of forced entry. A professional crew wouldn't need to break in. It would account for the deliberate, methodical nature of the crime scene. Investigators chase the claim across an ocean. DNA recovered from the scene is run through international databases and returns a possible match: a man living in Rome, Italy. FBI agents travel to the U.S. Embassy there, track him down, and bring him in. He cooperates without resistance, offering a fresh sample on the spot. For days, the case appears to be closing in on an international conspiracy. Then the results come back. Not a match. With the Rome lead dead and weeks of work pointing nowhere, investigators return to the source of the theory: Santos himself. A forensic psychiatrist evaluates him and uncovers a long, well-documented pattern that predates this case entirely. Santos has a history of falsely claiming responsibility for crimes he had nothing to do with. Inside a federal prison, being feared as the man behind a quadruple homicide buys a kind of protection most inmates can only imagine. Santos wanted that fear. He built an entire story to get it. There was no cartel hit, no crew sent to Tallahassee, no real connection to Los Zetas beyond rumor, weeks of cross-continental work, the DNA testing, the embassy interrogation, collapse in a single afternoon. The case resets. For the first time, detectives stop looking outward, toward organized crime, and start looking inward, toward the people who actually knew Brandi Peters. The circle of people close to Brandi isn't large, and one name rises above the rest: Henry Segura, her boyfriend, and the biological father of her youngest child. On paper, Henry fits the profile of a devastated father. When detectives bring him in for a background interview, they expect grief. They expect a man barely holding himself together. They don't get that. Henry is relaxed, almost casual. At several points, when detectives describe details of the crime, including details involving his own son, he laughs. Not the nervous, misplaced laugh of someone in shock. Something steadier. Something the detectives in the room find hard to sit across from. Pressed for an alibi, Henry gives one instantly. He says he wasn't at the house, hadn't been in days, and volunteers his phone records himself, confident enough to invite the check. The data backs him up, for now. His primary phone shows no movement that night. He walks out of that first interview believing, correctly, that he's just cleared his name. He has no idea how quickly that's about to change. While Henry's alibi holds, detectives keep pulling threads. One straight into his finances, where a motive has been sitting the whole time. Henry owes Brandi nearly $20,000 in unpaid child support. The state has been closing in on the debt for months, and wage garnishment, or jail, is closing in with it. Brandi wasn't backing down. She'd made clear she intended to collect, and that if Henry didn't come up with the money, she was prepared to escalate. Legally, publicly, permanently. For a man juggling a marriage and a hidden second relationship, that pressure wasn't just financial. It threatened to unravel everything he'd spent years keeping separate. This wasn't a motive built from a single flash of rage. It was colder than that. Weeks of mounting pressure and a mind quietly working out how to make the problem disappear for good. For a stretch, Henry's story holds together. His primary phone places him at home. His alibi checks out on paper. Then an investigator, digging through secondary records, finds what he never disclosed: a second phone registered in a way he clearly never expected anyone to trace back to him. 10 days after his first interview, Henry returns to the station believing this is a formality. He skips the lawyer. He walks in with the same confidence as before. The interview opens on familiar ground. His primary number, his whereabouts, the same story, delivered smoothly. Then a detective asks, quietly, about the second phone. The shift is immediate. Confidence gives way to a long, uncomfortable silence. Henry denies it at first, claims not to know what they mean. But investigators have the billing records and the location data, which tells a very different story than the one he gave 10 days earlier. It traces that phone leaving his neighborhood that night and arriving at Brandi's address inside the exact window the crime occurred. A week-old alibi collapses in the space of one question. Cornered, Henry doesn't confess. Instead, he starts talking and contradicting himself with nearly every sentence. One explanation gives way to another. He suggests he may have stopped by earlier that day and simply forgot to mention it. He suggests someone else might have taken his phone without his knowledge. By the end of a single interview, investigators count more than 20 inconsistencies in his account. While Henry works to explain away the phone data, a detective notices something else. Marks on his arms, the kind consistent with a physical struggle. Marks that line up with what investigators already suspect, that Brandi fought back hard enough to leave evidence behind. Even with the alibi in ruins, the phone data, and the marks on his skin, prosecutors don't yet have grounds for an arrest. The DNA analysis is still pending. Henry walks free a second time. Not for long. Months pass. Investigators quietly build the case. Financial records, cell tower data, everything gathered across 2 interviews. A grand jury eventually returns an indictment, 4 counts of first-degree murder. But when police arrive to arrest him, Henry is gone. Not avoiding calls. Gone. Hundreds of miles north, settled in Minnesota under a new number, trying to disappear. He doesn't get far. A fugitive task force locates him within days. From jail, awaiting extradition, he's allowed 1 recorded call. He calls his wife. Investigators expect grief. What they hear instead is an argument about infidelity, about Brandi, about years of a life he'd kept hidden from her. Henry doesn't defend himself, doesn't claim innocence. What he says instead sounds less like a man wrongly accused and more like a confession dressed up as self-pity. A line that will resurface later in front of a jury. Years after that Friday night, the case reaches trial. Prosecutors lay it all out. The collapsed alibi, the burner phone, the marks, the motive, the jail call. It's substantial, but there's a weakness. The DNA recovered from Brandi's fingernails turns out to be a mixed, degraded sample, not clean enough to tie Henry to the scene beyond doubt. The defense presses that gap hard. After days of deliberation, the jury deadlocks. The judge declares a mistrial. For Brandi's family, already years into waiting, it's a devastating setback. Henry returns to his cell, and a case that once looked airtight has to be rebuilt from scratch in front of a new jury. The second trial opens with a bold defense strategy, back to the cartel theory. Santos takes the stand again, hoping his discredited claim can still plant reasonable doubt. It doesn't survive cross-examination. Asked basic questions about the woman he claims he ordered killed, her age, her appearance, Santos has no answers. The theory that once sent investigators overseas dissolves in front of the jury. With that avenue closed, Henry takes the stand himself. For most of the trial, he holds onto the composed, wrongly accused persona he's carefully maintained. Steady answers, measured tone. Then, mid-cross-examination, the judge reminds him to let the prosecutor finish her question. Something breaks. He raises his voice, not at the prosecutor, but at the judge, in open court, in front of the jury. For a few seconds, the calm mask disappears entirely, replaced by exactly the temper prosecutors had been describing all along. A man who can't tolerate being challenged, especially by a woman in authority over him. One moment. In a courtroom, that's sometimes all it takes. This jury doesn't take long. Guilty. All 4 counts of first-degree murder. In an unusual final move, Henry's own defense asks the jury to sentence him to death, a calculated gamble built on Florida's faster appeals process for death sentences. The jury doesn't bite. They hand down 4 consecutive life sentences without parole instead, closing off both the fast-track appeal his team wanted and any chance of walking free again. He's let out in shackles at the start of a sentence that will last the rest of his life. At its core, this is a story about how far someone will go to escape a debt, not just the $20,000 he owed, but the larger debt of being known publicly for exactly who he was. Brandi Peters opened her door that night to someone she trusted, in a home where her children had just finished dinner and homework on what should have been an unremarkable evening. She fought. The evidence makes that clear. Hard enough to leave behind the trace that would eventually help convict him, even after a false confession from a stranger in prison, a fabricated alibi, a flight across state lines, and a courtroom gamble that ultimately failed.